Hi, and welcome to this. I think this is the second episode of Unscripted. And I'm joined by my good friend Tim Groot, who's the CEO of Grip. And Grip are an event tech company that help event organizers facilitate connections at their event. At least that's how it started. Tim, welcome. Thank you for being a guinea pig.
Great to be here, Adam. Excited about talking with you about in an unscripted format. Very
In
exciting.
an unscripted format, yeah, who knows? This might actually be worth listening to. So, Tim, you and I met. I think you just founded Grip. So that's how long we've known each other. I think when we work together, we always try to do some different things as well. So I think I learned a lot from you. I can't speak for you, so you can tell me whether you did as well. But as part of this unscripted episode, I want to explore how, from the time you first started to where we are now, how events are doing the job of connecting people, because the reason why we run events is to connect people at the end of the day. We might have stands, we might have sessions, but it's really about creating the human connections in whatever format you're running it on. So just talk to me a little bit about how you see the evolution of all of that, and how organizers are lining up behind that aspiration to create more connections.
So the way that I kind of think about it from when I started about kind of 8 9 years ago, I'm still scared to say 10, and
I
kind of
know it's been a long
where
time,
we are.
right?
Yeah, and so I think that actually events have very much gone through various phases, right? They've gone through various experience layers. So I think very much kind of pre-COVID, actually, I think people started going more into content, and I thought it was all about other parts than necessarily I think the connecting of people. And I actually think that through COVID, people realized the importance of interaction and relationship between people. So I think events have actually kind of leaned in more over the last couple of years into the importance of facilitating relationship between people. But for me, the powerful thing of events is not just the connection itself, but it is what it enables. Because in the end, what events are about is moving markets forward faster, right? Like, why do you put on an event where it's a moment in time to bring people together to discuss, connect, and move something forward, right? Like, you connect with new people, and that is what enables you or reconnect with existing ones. But you're able to move the world as a whole forward a little bit. And if you think about Steve Jobs saying stuff like, "Hey, we're putting a dent into the universe," really what an event does is it creates an opportunity to create that dent by creating a high density of interesting people that are able to discuss a particular topic and make a particular amount of progress on a particular subject. And that requires knowledge sharing, that requires people coming together, it requires thought provoking ideas being shared by great speakers. It requires the one to one conversation, and it requires the group discussions that enable all of these different layers and need to be layered into an experience in order to kind of maximize the amount of impact that you can have in the time that you're spending together. That's like at a high level how I think about the impact of events and the true potential that we're trying to unlock.
So when you say that, I am 100% behind you with this on this as well, right? So we have within my work, we've created what I call this IAC framework. It's about information exchange, it's about knowledge sharing, it's about the experience and the action. So that's what you're saying. We've created a moment in time, and the reason why we've done it is because we want to shift something forward. And we want to evidence that by creating this moment in time, we've made that shift. My question to you is, when you're working with organizers, how aligned are they behind that outcome? Because I always felt that even when I was in the organizing industry, working for some really large companies, too often the conversation became more about how do we change the layout? Where do we put more stands? Where do we do this? So little of the conversation was around how do we make sure that we maximize the connections, the interaction, and the information exchange? Have we shifted?
So I think that there has always been at the kind of event director, portfolio director, kind of the senior layers within an organization, the people that you see rising to the top at most organizers are able to take that shift and think more strategically about why are we doing this? What are the objectives of this event? I think the hard part of events is that there is such a logistical layer to creating the product of an event, whether it's on the marketing side, like, hey, how am I going to reach these people to make sure they show up, to the sales side of the, the wheeler dealer. You have to somehow get these exhibitors and companies to buy into it, and you need to create clever schemes how you're actually going to make sure that happens. And then, of course, there is on the logistics side of actually, dealing with a tube strike a week before your event. So there are so many kind of ancillary kind of problems that I think organizers run into, that it is really, really hard for them to stay focused on these bigger objectives. I do think that more and more they're aware that that is very important, and that is how they can kind of create value in the long term. But it is much harder within the context of an event than, let's say, when you're a pure tech company. Right? Like pure tech is much more of a pure pursuit, in the sense that it is just turning raw brain power with pretty limitless constraints into experiences on software, which is why software moves so quickly. I think the reason that events as an industry moves a bit slower is because there is all these really real physical constraints that make it much harder to execute towards these kind of bigger objectives that you have. I do think there is that desire for organizers more and more. And, I think that now they're starting to make a bit more money again. They're investing more into kind of going in that direction, as far as I can see.
So I agree with that summary because having run events myself, 3 weeks out from the event, the thing you're scared about most is how we're going to manifest this, and is anybody going to turn up? I mean, I remember I used to stand at the corner of Olympia watching the tube come in, just to make sure that people are coming to my event. It sounds bizarre, but it became a ritual. So I agree
Yep.
with you, right? So we get wrapped up in it. So let's move that forward. How can we enable ourselves as the events industry to start to abstract the two things and get to a world where the very valuable noise around logistics and the constraints and the issues it's got does not keep cannibalizing this macro vision that we all have? And I sit on your advisory board, everybody kind of says the same thing. We want to be able to do this, but we get sidetracked. Do you think we need to commoditize the logistics and delivery a little bit more so it stops taking less of the airtime? Or is it a tech problem?
I don't know, to be honest. Genuinely, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where the problems.
Mhm. Well, I think one of the, and my view, and working with clients, we're starting to show our clients how to connect the dots between seeing, in terms of data and visualizations, these connections and what it does for their rebooks and what it does for their audience acquisition, like, taking it up by 25% and taking rebooks up and so on, because we can use the data to evidence. And I kind of feel like for the longest time in the event tech space or any tech space, we're shouting out answers before understanding the problem. And I think the real challenge, and I genuinely don't know how to solve it, but I feel like it's a path, is to be able to connect the dots between how does enabling this help your logistics, help your event acquisition, right? Because if you're running around trying to get more people back and your annual attrition rate of getting people back or reacquisition rate is at 10%. What you really want to do is move that 10% to 50%, and I've
Yeah.
run events where that's possible. And you're then going, okay, well, what do I need to do to enable that? And that is where I believe something like what Grip does can help, but you're completely changing the narrative, right?
Mm.
You're saying, if we really align behind creating these deep connections,
Mm.
you will have a reacquisition rate of 20, 30, 40%, which makes you breathe easier.
Yep.
That is why this is important. And
Yeah.
I just feel like we aren't joining those dots well enough yet.
Yeah. So I think, like, if you kind of go back to that initial kind of point, right? Like, I think that some organizers are able to move a little bit more in that direction because they've either standardized their definition of what an event is, and made it more cookie cutter, and as a result made that a lot more straightforward, right? Like, I think easy fares is an interesting example. I mean, it's kind of in the name, easy fares, but it's actually very much more standardized than some of the other large trade show organizers in the way that they approach what an event is in terms of length, booths, and what all of these things mean is much more standardized for them, which makes the delivery aspect of it easier from a logistical perspective. And in some cases, they've got quite a lot of their own venues. So like, that makes it all much more streamlined. So they have more kind of brain capacity to actually think about some of these ROI questions and how do we deliver value and how do we structure the events more effectively. They also, as a result, build a stronger muscle that is able to, do it in the same way. Like events is a top sport, but because events can be so different, even if you work at a big organizer, the defense show can be very different than the gaming event and like different than the pharmaceutical event. All of them are different. And as a result, it's a bit like being a professional sports person, but you're playing a different sports every day. And so like, I think that that's kind of quite challenging for them. I think that if you can kind of get that to a kind of high level of standardization, it becomes slightly easier to then start thinking about that next layer. But the problem with technology and events has genuinely been that it is very hard to pull it back to the ROI of why you should use technology. Event technology, I think, has had a structural problem where it is not being very good at communicating the ROI of why you should invest in it. And I think that that has made it difficult for organizers to say, hey, we're going to commit to a long term and we're going to go on this journey because it's hard to prove the ROI around it. And that drives down price, which limits the ability to innovate because there is not enough resources and money available within the tech companies. And so like that's a kind of spiral that I think you've seen over the last kind of 2 decades. I think now it's getting better because, as I say, organizers are starting to see that in order to get rebook rates up, retention rates up, create better experiences, they're going to need to use technology. And if they're going to need to use technology, you need to make sure they have strong partners. So, I think it's kind of changing. But the amount of times I've said, like, I'll sit with an organizer and it's like, oh, yeah, but we prefer building this on top of Microsoft or Salesforce because that's a big tech company. And that's where they're willing to do with like, a kind of a long-term view, but they might not necessarily immediately get to that kind of longer-term view with kind of dedicated event tech companies. But I think that's changing. And I think, they're starting to think more long-term in terms of how they can use data in order to really influence the user experience, really influence like exhibitor retention, and use that in the process really. So we're getting there. We're getting there.
I think what you've hit on is a massive issue, and you and I have kind of off and on been talking about it as well. I mean, let me park for a second the issue of people wanting to build massive monoliths because I personally think it stifles innovations. Just my view. But do you not think in the world that we live in today, where we're doing some of this amazing work of now being able to extract analytics data, collide stuff, and actually join the dots, that as a event tech company or as a event tech industry, when I look at what would be possible with the
Mm.
tech, it's amazing, right? Because if you have an app that can send signals to your behavioral database, call it Google Analytics, whatever, you can join all these dots up. So the ability to show the ROI becomes absolutely awesome. You can even potentially deliver intent scores to exhibitors and say, hey, this cohort of people is showing a lot of interest and they're moving around. But I still feel there's a data literacy issue within the entire industry to be able to activate something like that, because that's a data product at the end of the day. And your app is just another place where signals are collected, be it with the connections.
Yeah.
So how far off are we of thinking about, because you said it, right? We create events to create a massive shift. Now we need to
Mm.
evidence that actually happens.
Yep.
And where is the real disconnect? Is it because we are stuck in being logistics people and operational delivery people rather than product people? And that's a really a tough thing to say and swallow sometimes.
Well, I think that if you think about like the events industry, right, you've got commercial organizers of conferences and trade shows, but like, media companies, I think are very interesting, right? Like yesterday I was with one of the biggest media companies in the US and their chief product officer. And she said to me, we don't know which one of our subscribers to our massive newspaper are attending our events. We don't have that data synced up. And like this company has pretty much unlimited budget. Basic thing like that for a company that big to still be kind of in the process of figuring that out shows that I don't think that this is exclusive to a pure trade show organizer. I think that, and then the question is, why is that? Well, the reason is that I think events are just like hotels. I often think about like Accor hotels. With the CEO, I saw an interview with him, and he said he was asked, "What did you do during the pandemic, and how did you kind of manage the company?" He said, "The key thing that we needed was amazing hotel managers that were able to take decisions on the spot for the best, for the benefit of the guest, right? Because they talk about guests, they're not customers or users, they're guests." And I think about that often because I think that that is what organizers often think is that in order to create the best event, I'm going to kind of decentralize my decision making to the event manager or the marketing manager or the logistics manager, because the closer they are to the attendee and to the event participant, the better the decision making will be. And I think that it's therefore typically seen more as in the hospitality and services industry, which is very much focused on the experience and in the moment, which I think benefits the short term delivery of a great experience, but might lack the ability to create a more long term view and how all of it fits together. So I think that there is an opportunity for starting to combine and bring those two worlds together. So like a nice example is, I don't know if you've ever kind of musical theory, there was something called the Camelot wheel. And so the Camelot wheel is what DJs use to determine which songs go after each other. So you think that, when Armin van Buuren is doing a, DJ set, that he's just picking some random songs. But there is actually a huge amount of science that goes into which songs fit together. Like he might say, "Hey, I'm going to go from a D minor to an A minor, like with a 7A to an 8A." And like he's very carefully, and then he knows that he can go like across on the Camelot wheel from an 8A to a E flat minor, right? Like he knows which kind of jumps he can make on that Camelot wheel to create a 1 hour music set or 2 hours or 3 hours that really fit together in terms of the energy levels, the emotions, the impact that that music is having. And I think like if we think a bit more long term about where events need to get to, is to develop that level of understanding of like musical theory, but then for kind of experience theory. I think what we could end up with is an idea of saying, hey, I know that if I have a speaker that is like a big keynote speaker that creates this level of energy, that afterwards I can jump to to a panel discussion, or I can jump to small group discussion, I don't know, for example. And we can start creating a theory of why that is the right jump to make. And we can also start saying, hey, these two things, they don't fit well together. So I think that, your model and just in general, kind of the way that I think we can start using science and data to create better experiences, we need to actually create a framework and a theory around that to be able to start articulating what things fit together. And the only way that's going to be picked up is if we can then, of course, prove that it has a certain ROI, that it then has a certain impact on the quality of the experience. But that's kind of directionally how I've been thinking about this space.
In that case, we're thinking the same thing. And it's funny you should say that because I had a call with a large company who'd run a huge amount of events in-house. And they're also thinking along the same lines. It's about, okay, you know, what fits together well to create the shift that we need. And maybe you're right. It's actually the companies that own the entire thing might be the first to glue all of this together, because in commercial events there are too many other actors who have a voice. If you've got a massive sponsor who's given you a quadrillion pounds and you suddenly say, listen, what you're doing is not quite right, that's a tough conversation, and you multiply that conversation by 80 people, might never happen. But I do think you're on the money in terms of your thinking, and I'm not just saying that because I'm thinking the same things, but it's about how we need a language to codify this, don't we? Because we need to. So someone in my data science team said we need a way of codifying all these parts of an event in numbers so that we can see, a bit like your DJ analogy, how it joins together. And we haven't even started on that.
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing is like the question is, can you, and you of course kind of try to disrupt, or are trying to disrupt this space kind of from the outside. So if you talk about Clayton Christensen innovator's dilemma, the question is a event, because it's kind of taking a typical trade show, it's pretty profitable, it's working well, it's very kind of, it's not very interesting for an organizer to go and change that. And the reason that it is because, well, best case scenario, you're running an annual show. So between the age of 25 and 65, you've got 40 peak moments that you're working on. I mean, I know people in Germany that are working on a show that happens every 3 or 4 years. That means that their entire career is dependent on 10 moments of 5 days, right? That's their entire career between 25 and 65. And why would you go and try and disrupt all of that when it's been working for the last 100 years? And so, like, I think the kind of willingness to change in some instances is not really worth the risk. So then it becomes a Clayton Christensen innovator's dilemma, right? Like, why would I go and shoot myself in the foot by trying different things that might cannibalize my revenue, might make my sponsors unhappy, might result in a short-term dip in attendees, and maybe I won't even be here to see the positive outcome from it like 10 years from now, because those cycles can be so long in order to have an impact. So maybe what is needed is this kind of upstart, completely starting from scratch, disruptive approach. But then the challenge that you have is that we didn't really see that during COVID, right? COVID would have been the perfect moment to kind of take this really disruptive approach. Some people tried, but it's been quite hard. And I think that actually the ones that I think are being successful at it is the ones that are creating something that is just new enough to kind of take it to the next level, but it's not too far out there, right? So, for example, Jay Weintraub with kind of the manifest and blueprints, he does some incredible events which are convexes, similar to like the Money 2020s, the shop talks, and so forth. And I think that is really interesting as a space. The convex segment, I think, is extremely powerful, and what it does is combines, I think, to a much higher degree, the two worlds of conferences and trade shows into one experience. Now, that might seem like, well, it's just putting things together in a different way. Yeah, to some extent it is, but it is allowing a platform to then start building more of these experiences into it in terms of different interaction formats. So I do see that there is a kind of a direction that we're going here, which is pretty powerful. It's just, it's taking a bit of time. But yeah, I think we can push forward on that kind of course that we're on, to be honest.
I think you're right. And what I see as well is slowly the narrative around tech is also changing, I believe. I mean, I'm impatient. I don't believe it's changing fast enough, but you're starting to see people ask the question of, I've got this problem to solve. What role does tech play in it? Rather than, whenever I was within events companies, it was about someone going, oh, I've created this new tech, and then everybody got together and say, oh, how do we use it, right? Which is a different way of thinking about it. Are you starting to see that as well in terms of the grip? I know you're moving more towards these strategic partnerships and relationships where it becomes a symbiotic thing with the event organizer and everybody's aligned behind creating maximum value.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
definitely, and I think it's much more actually. It's increasingly becoming much more about data, and and kind of how you use that, and how you can have strategic conversations around that, and how can you combine technology with a great service layer, right? So I think that it's also the realization that tech is not necessarily the be all and end all, and I think that the service layer is very interesting, because it enables the technology to be more successful, and I think with the new wave of kind of generative AI, you're actually going to be able to automate that service layer to some extent. And I think that's also a very interesting trend that we're starting to see. So I think, generative AI, I think, is going to have a big impact to be able to automate a lot of these logistical points that we were making earlier. So, I was planning a trip with some friends, and I was actually using ChatGPT to figure out, the logistical side of it. So you can start actually, starting to plan things in a very different way. And then I think the other trends, and kind of people have been kind of skeptical of it. I think that augmented reality with Apple Vision Pro is going to completely change the game. It's going to be insane. The most powerful thing, and I don't know if I told you this before, is with the Apple Vision Pro headsets, when let's say we're in a room with 100 people and you're wearing one and the other 98 people are all wearing a Vision Pro headset. When you, with your headset, are looking at somebody else wearing one, because what they've done is
Right,
they've
of
scanned
course,
your
right.
face. They've scanned your face before they put on the headset. And then when you're looking at the other person, they can abstract that away. So it just looks like a normal person. If I'm the only one there for that is not wearing the headset, I'm the only one that is seeing 99 people in the room wearing one of these headsets, which is the ultimate network effect. We can kind of almost layer over what we're seeing and how we're perceiving the world around us. And it becomes a true blend of the digital and the physical into one layer. And it is the ultimate kind of concept of taking the fact that the reality that we live in is a constructed reality and being able to overlay that with a another layer, basically another layer into the constructed reality, and that is a digital layer, and that's when we can start, doing all sorts of really cool stuff in this
When
space.
you when you look at the look ahead, I mean they're 3.5 grand at the minute, right? And I reckon it'll be 5 years before they're 300 quid, and that'll change the game.
Actually, I think the opposite. I think people will, I think if you look at the percentage of people's income that is spent on technology, that percentage is still going up. So I think that we will see that percentage continue to go up. I think it's much more about, as a society, creating more abundance, right? So rather than more scarcity. So actually making sure that, for example, the percentage of your income that is spent on housing, for example, should go down. So anyway, I think at least that I don't think the price will come down, but maybe as a percentage of your overall spending, actually you'll just spend more on technology because you can see the massive impact that it has on your life to a greater extent.
So if we finish off now on one final piece. Are we kind of agreeing that the biggest disconnect at the moment is how we join all this data up to really show the value of each individual component, like something like a grip, or, you mentioned this publisher who said, like, we don't know who of our subscribers is actually coming to the event. I mean, that is such an easy question to answer. I mean, it's literally that mindset, that shift just needs to change, right? And once you start answering that question, you've got full resolution. You go, we've got so and so many newsletter subscribers, 50% of them attend the event. That's the value. That's how it joins up.
I think that it is the technology being linked up properly, consistently. And I think that the consistency part is harder than the linking up of technology. It is very easy to do all the integrations and all the syncs and all the places and all the analysis for one event at one moment in time. Everyone can do that, every organizer. But what is much harder is create the organizational discipline to do it day in, day out for every single event. Like with everything, discipline is the hardest thing. And I think that that requires discipline on the technologists, on the products that you use that make it easy to install that discipline, and in the organizers consistently looking at the same numbers in the same way, asking the same questions to get to a consistent level of performance. So I think it's, as an industry, it is about being disciplined about how we look at the future and creating a strong path, starting with leadership on every side of the table, and working towards that consistently for all the events that take place.
I think that's an amazing full stop, Tim. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. And thank you all for listening.